They believed they were playing the perfect chess match to seize my grandmother's vast estate on Christmas Day. My husband and my own sister never suspected I had watched their dirty moves for months. I did not scream or fight back then. Instead, my grandmother and I wrapped a special gift for them. We transformed our lavish holiday party into a public execution of their greed, where a single piece of paper became their ruin. My name is Sarah. At 32 years of age, I managed the creative vision for Ethelgard Industries, a role that demanded an obsessive attention to detail. I noticed when a font was a fraction off-center. I noticed when a color palette shifted by a single shade. Yet, for months, I had failed to notice the rot spreading through the foundation of my own marriage. Chicago in December was a beast. The wind off the lake rattled the windows of our brownstone, but the chill inside felt far more permanent. Mark, my husband of 5 years, claimed he was busy planning the perfect Christmas for us. He smiled that charming, boyish smile I had fallen in love with, but his eyes were always somewhere else, scanning a horizon I could not see. I just need to finish this year-end project. Mark stammered one Tuesday night, stumbling through the front door at 11 o'clock. I moved to hug him, burying my face in his coat to hide the suspicion already blooming in my chest. "You're working so hard, honey," I said, inhaling deeply. That was when the first crack appeared in the picture-perfect facade. Beneath the stale scent of office coffee and cold city air, there was a distinct, lingering note of sandalwood. It was earthy, sweet, and unmistakable. It was not a cologne. It was a perfume. Specifically, it was the exact perfume my younger sister, Jessica, had worn since high school. I pulled away, studying his face. He looked flushed, but not from the cold. Then there was Jessica herself. My sister usually treated money like a foreign language she refused to learn. She constantly complained about rent and bills, always playing the victim of a cruel economy. Yet, last week, she sashayed into my kitchen swinging a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. "Oh, Sarah, you look so tired," she had cooed, pouring herself a glass of my expensive wine without asking. "You really should let Mark take care of things more. You stress too much." Her voice dripped with a sugary sweetness that tasted artificial. Since when did she care about my stress levels? Since when did she advise me to rely on Mark? The uneasiness turned into nausea during Sunday dinner. We were all seated around the mahogany table. I looked up from my plate of roast chicken and caught it. It was a split second. Mark looked at Jessica, and she looked back. It was not the look of a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law sharing a family joke. It was a look of shared knowledge. A look of hungry anticipation. It was the look of two wolves deciding how to divide the sheep. "So," Mark started, clearing his throat a bit too loudly, breaking the silence. "How is Beatrice doing? Is she getting any weaker?" My grandmother, Beatrice, was 80 years old and the matriarch of our family. Her health was failing, but her fortune was substantial. Mark had asked about her health 3 times that week. "She is fine, Mark," I said, my voice steady, though my pulse began to race. "Why do you ask? Just worried," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. Later that night, while the shower ran in the master bathroom, I picked up Mark's phone from the nightstand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I typed in the passcode he had used for 5 years. The screen shook. Incorrect passcode. I stared at the device. He had never hidden anything from me. I tried again, my fingers trembling. Incorrect passcode. I set the phone down exactly as I found it and opened my laptop to check our joint bank account. My breath hitched. A withdrawal of $10,000 in cash had been made yesterday. He had not said a word. I sat alone in the dim light of our bedroom. The steam from the shower seeped under the door, carrying the scent of his soap, but I felt like I was drowning in cold water. My husband and my sister were wearing masks. They were actors on a stage I had built and paid for. They thought I was the oblivious, hard-working wife, too busy with her career to notice the knife they were sharpening. I felt a profound sense of isolation, trapped in my own home with enemies who wore the faces of my loved ones. I wanted to storm into the bathroom and demand answers. I wanted to scream until the windows shattered. But the cold logic that made me successful at Ethelgard Industries took over. Screaming would only make them hide better. No, I whispered to the empty room, my hands clenching into fists on the bedsheet. I need to be sure. I would not ask. I would watch. The next morning, I did not go to the office. Instead, I turned my home into a surveillance state. I installed a camera the size of a button inside the smoke detector in the living room and another beneath the rearview mirror of Mark's sedan. My hands did not shake as I taped the wires down. This was a project, and I was managing it with the same cold efficiency I applied to my work at Ethelgard Industries. I needed digital forensics, so I called David, an old college friend who worked in cybersecurity. I met him at a coffee shop and handed him Mark's old iPad. The screen cracked from a drop 3 years ago. Mark had tossed it in a drawer and forgotten about it, but he had been too lazy to log out of his iCloud account. Get everything, I told David, my voice low. Even the trash folder, even the drafts. When David called me back 2 hours later, his voice was grim. Sarah, you need to sit down for this. He sent the files to my secure server. The screen filled with recovered messages, and my stomach dropped. It was not just a fling. It was a synchronized calendar. Lunch at the Den. One message read, "She has a meeting until 2. Come over now." Read another. The Den was not a hotel. It was Jessica's apartment. My husband was spending his lunch breaks in my sister's bed, in the apartment I had helped her pay the deposit for. But the audio from the car camera was what truly shattered me. I watched the file timestamped from yesterday afternoon. Mark was driving, and Jessica was on speakerphone. "She is still at the office." Mark laughed, the sound tinny through the recording. "She thinks she is saving the world with those ad campaigns. God, she is so boring lately." "Let her work." Jessica's voice purred through the speakers, a sound that made my blood run cold. "The more she works, the more we play. She is such a useful little idiot, isn't she? Does she suspect anything? Not a clue," Mark replied. "She trusts me blindly." I sat in my home office, freezing in the heated room. The word idiot stung, but the tone cut deeper. It was not just lust. It was malice. I realized then that Jessica had never truly loved me as a sister. All those years of borrowing clothes she never returned, of small snide comments about my grades or my job. It all culminated here. Stealing Mark was not about love. It was a trophy hunt. She wanted to prove she could take what was mine. They did not just betray me. They viewed me as an obstacle to be mocked. I kept digging, fueled by a rage that felt like swallowing broken glass. I logged into the credit card portal for the supplementary card I had given Mark for household emergencies. There it was, a receipt from a high-end jeweler for a diamond tennis bracelet. $3,000. "Happy anniversary," I whispered to the empty room, looking at the date on the screen. It was purchased on the same day he told me he forgot his wallet and needed cash for a client lunch. He had bought my sister jewelry with my money. When the front door opened that evening, I was sitting on the couch, reading a magazine. My insides were twisting into knots, a physical revulsion rising in my throat. "Hey, babe," Mark said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. He smelled of cold air and mints, trying to mask the day's sins. "Missed you." I forced a smile that felt like it was carved out of wood. "Missed you too," I lied. His touch made my skin crawl. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to scream that I knew he had been mocking me with Jessica hours ago. I wanted to smash the iPad over his head. But I did nothing. I was the dutiful wife. I let him hold my hand while we watched television, my mind racing. I mentally began drafting a list of divorce attorneys. I thought I had seen the bottom of the well. I thought this was a simple, sordid story of adultery and theft. I was wrong. I had no idea that the betrayal was just the surface of a much darker ocean, and they were planning to drown me in it. The tax season was approaching, and I needed our financial records. I waited until Mark left for work, claiming he had an early meeting with a client. Once his car disappeared down the street, I went straight to the wall safe in his study. I spun the dial, entering the combination he thought I did not know. The heavy steel door swung open with a silent glide. I shuffled through the usual stacks of insurance policies and property deeds, but my hand brushed against something unfamiliar at the very bottom. It was a bright red folder, shoved far back as if he intended for it never to see the light of day. I pulled it out and opened it on the desk. The first document was not ours. It was a photocopy of my grandmother Beatrice's last will and testament. My breath caught in my throat. Mark had no business possessing this. I flipped through the pages. The margins were covered in his erratic handwriting. He had circled the section detailing the liquid assets and real estate holdings. Beside the figure estimating the estate's value, he had written a single word in red ink: jackpot. "My God," I whispered, my fingers tightening on the paper. I dug deeper into the folder. There were printouts of emails between Mark and a lawyer I had never heard of, a man named Arthur Vane. The subject lines were chillingly pragmatic. Regarding marital assets and inheritance. One email header read, I read Mark's query aloud, my voice trembling in the empty room. If my wife inherits a lump sum and deposits it into our joint account for renovations, does that become community property subject to division upon divorce? The lawyer's reply was highlighted in yellow. Yes. Once commingled, the inheritance loses its separate status. You would be entitled to 50%. The room seemed to spin. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. This was not just a crime of passion or a midlife crisis. This was a long con. They were not just sleeping together. They were waiting. They were waiting for my grandmother to die so I would get paid, and then they would rob me blind. I found a printed screenshot of a text conversation between Mark and Jessica. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. Jessica wrote, "Just need the old hag to go this Christmas. We will have everything. Please, baby. Just try to tolerate my sister a bit longer." Her voice is grating. I know. Mark replied, I am trying. She is talking about investing the inheritance in a trust. We need to convince her to buy that vacation home instead. Once the money hits the joint account, I am gone. I felt bile rise in my throat. The old hag. That was what they called the woman who had paid for Jessica's college tuition. That was what they called the woman who welcomed Mark into our family like a son. At the back of the folder, I found the reason for their desperation. It was a credit report and a stack of overdue notices. Mark was not just greedy, he was drowning. He had secret accounts with online gambling sites showing losses of over $80,000. He had made terrible investments in cryptocurrency that had crashed to zero. He was broke. My grandmother's death was not just a windfall for him, it was his only lifeline. He intended to use my grief as a smokescreen to steal my legacy. He planned to comfort me with one hand while picking my pocket with the other. I took out my phone and photographed every single page. I made sure the text was legible. I captured the emails, the handwritten notes, the gambling debts, and the hateful texts. I placed the documents back exactly how I found them, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly with the dust outline on the safe floor. I closed the safe and spun the dial. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I stood up, no longer shaking. The sadness had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "You want her money," I said to the empty air, my voice devoid of warmth. "You will not touch a single penny." They were targeting Beatrice. My grandmother was not just a relative. She was the only person who had ever truly loved me without condition. They were counting on her death, perhaps even hoping to hasten it with stress. I realized then that I was not just fighting for a divorce settlement. I was fighting for her life and her dignity. I walked out of that study a different woman. I was no longer a victim. I was the guardian at the gate, and I was armed with the truth. The drive to my grandmother's estate felt like a funeral procession of one. Beatrice lived in a sprawling manor that smelled of old money and lemon polish. At 80 years of age, her body was failing her. She sat in her favorite velvet armchair by the fireplace, a blanket draped over her thin legs. But her eyes were as sharp as cut diamonds. She saw through people, and I prayed she would see the truth I was about to lay at her feet. I did not waste time with pleasantries about the weather or her tea. I pulled a chair close to hers and opened my bag. "Grandma, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice steady despite the thumping of my heart. "I have found something terrible." I laid it all out. The photographs of the red folder, the recordings of Mark and Jessica mocking us, the emails with the lawyer. I watched her face as she read the messages where her granddaughter called her an old hag and wished for her death. I watched her hand tremble as she saw Mark's notes about the jackpot. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. Beatrice closed her eyes, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. She looked small, defeated. She started, her voice breaking. "I cannot believe they would." "It is real, Grandma," I whispered, reaching out to hold her cold hand. "They want everything." Beatrice took a shuddering breath, and then, right before my eyes, the frailty vanished, her spine straightened. The grief in her eyes hardened into something ancient and terrifying. She looked at me, and I saw the woman who had built a dynasty from nothing. "That explains it," she said, her voice suddenly crisp. "Jessica has been coming here for months. She told me you were in trouble. Sarah, she said you and Mark were drowning in debt because of your bad investments. She asked for $50,000 last month to help Sarah save her house without hurting your pride. I gave it to her in cash." My blood ran cold. "I never asked for a dime. My finances are perfect." "I know that now," Beatrice said, her grip on my hand tightening until it hurt. "She used your name to rob me while waiting for me to die." We wept then. We cried for the little girl Jessica used to be, for the husband Mark pretended to be, and for the family we thought we had. It was a purging rain, washing away the denial and the pity. But we did not cry for long. Beatrice dried her eyes with a lace handkerchief and looked at the calendar on the wall. Christmas was less than a week away. "They want a Christmas gift," Beatrice asked, a dangerous smile touching her lips. "I will give them one to remember." "Mom and Dad cannot know," I said quickly. "They will just make excuses for her. They will say it is a mistake." "Your parents are weak," Beatrice agreed, reaching for the antique telephone on the side table. "They created a monster by never telling her no. This stays between us." She picked up the receiver and dialed a number she knew by heart. It was late, but for Beatrice, the world operated on her schedule. "Henderson!" she barked into the phone the moment the line connected. "I do not care what time it is. Get your pen. I am changing my will. Tonight." I sat there, watching her command the room. I felt a shift within myself. I had walked in here as a victim, a woman betrayed by her husband and sister. I was sitting here now as a partner. I was no longer the prey. I was the hunter, and the matriarch of the family had just handed me a spear. "Make sure the trust clauses are ironclad," Beatrice instructed the lawyer, her eyes locking with mine. "I want Sarah to have total control. And Henderson, I want a special clause for the unfaithful." She hung up the phone and looked at me. "Go home. Sarah, kiss your husband, hug your sister. Let them think they have won. We will set the table for Christmas, and we will serve them exactly what they deserve. So I left the estate feeling lighter than air. The cold December wind did not bother me anymore. I had the fire of my grandmother burning inside me, and together, we were going to burn their house of lies to the ground. The week leading up to Christmas was a masterclass in deception. The air in our house was thick with the scent of pine needles and the suffocating stench of betrayal. Mark and Jessica were vibrating with a nervous energy that they tried desperately to disguise as holiday spirit. But I knew better. They were like vultures circling a dying animal, waiting for the moment to strike. My grandmother played her part with terrifying precision. When Mark called her on Tuesday, put on speakerphone so Jessica could listen in, Beatrice made her voice sound thin and trembling. I do not know if I will make it to the new year. Mark, she wheezed into the phone. I want to have the lawyer read the will on Christmas Eve. I want to see you all. Settled. Before I close my eyes, I watched Mark's eyes widen. He muted the phone to look at Jessica, a feral grin spreading across his face. He pumped his fist in the air silently, mouthing the word yes. Then he unmuted it, his voice dropping to a somber, caring baritone. Oh, Beatrice, please do not talk like that. But if that is what brings you peace, we will be there. We love you so much. They took the bait hook, line, and sinker. Convinced that their windfall was days away, their caution evaporated. I found a crumpled brochure for a luxury dealership in Mark's jacket pocket. A quick call to the bank confirmed my suspicions. He had not just looked, he had acted. He had secured a high-interest short-term loan from a predatory lender to put a down payment of $20,000 on a brand-new Italian sports car. He was spending money he did not have, betting his life on a grave that was not yet dug. The dinners were the hardest part. On Thursday, Jessica came over for a family meal. I sat across from them, chewing on roast beef that tasted like ash. Mark reached over and squeezed my hand on top of the table. You have worked so hard this year. Sarah, he said, his eyes crinkling with fake adoration. I promise. Next year will be different. I am going to take care of you. I smiled, fighting the urge to stab my fork into his hand. Under the table, I saw the movement. His other hand was resting on Jessica's knee, his thumb stroking her thigh. She smirked at me while sipping her wine, her eyes mocking my ignorance. Speaking of the party, Jessica said, setting her glass down. Sarah, you should wear that gray wool dress you have. The old one. It makes you look so responsible. You know how Grandma loves modesty. That is a great idea, I replied, keeping my voice even. What about you? Oh, I bought something new. She giggled. Since it might be Grandma's last Christmas, I want to look my best for her. A gold sequin gown, very festive. She wanted to look like the heiress she believed she was about to become. She wanted me to look like the dull, gray servant. You will look stunning, Jess, Mark added, looking at her with hungry eyes before turning back to me. And you will look nice, Sarah. I decided to raise the stakes. If they were going to crash and burn, I wanted an audience. Mark, honey, I said, pouring him more wine. Since this is such a big night and Grandma is making an announcement, maybe we should invite more people. Why not invite your boss? And the partners, show them how devoted you are to family. It might help your promotion. Mark hesitated, but his vanity won out. He imagined them witnessing his ascent to wealth. That is actually brilliant. Sarah, I will invite the whole team. Let them see what real success looks like. He sent the invites immediately. I watched the notifications pop up on his phone, each RSVP a nail in his coffin. He was inviting his boss, his colleagues, and even the friends he owed money to, promising them a spectacular celebration. Every lie he told me now felt like a physical blow. but I absorbed it. I was a sponge for their deceit. I counted the hours. 48 hours. 24 hours. The tension in the house was so high it felt like the walls were vibrating. I lay in bed on the night of the 23rd, listening to Mark's steady breathing beside me. He was dreaming of millions. I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, dreaming of the look on his face when the clock struck 12. The stage was set. The actors were in place. All that was left was to drop the curtain. Christmas Eve at the manor was usually a time of warmth and nostalgia, but tonight, the sprawling estate felt less like a home and more like a courtroom. My grandmother had spared no expense. The great hall was decked in garlands of silver and pine, and a 12-foot tree glittered with crystal ornaments, casting fractured light across the marble floors. It was breathtaking, but the air was heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm. I stood at the top of the grand staircase and watched the guests arrive. The room filled quickly. My parents were there, beaming with naive pride, completely unaware that their family was imploding. Mingling with them were Mark's boss, several senior partners from his firm, and a few men in sharp, ill-fitting suits who stood near the buffet. These were the creditors Mark had bragged to me about knowing men he owed tens of thousands of dollars to. I had sent them personal invitations, implying that Mark would be settling his accounts tonight. They looked like sharks smelling blood in the water. Then, the doors opened for the guests of honor. Mark and Jessica entered together. My sister wore the gold sequin gown she had taunted me with, shimmering like a cheap trophy. Mark was in a tuxedo, his hair slicked back. They walked close enough that their arms brushed with every step, a proximity that screamed intimacy to anyone paying attention. To the room, they looked like a supportive brother-in-law and sister-in-law. To me, they looked like thieves arriving to loot a burning building. I descended the stairs. I had left the gray wool dress Jessica suggested in the back of my closet. Instead, I wore a floor-length gown of crimson silk, tailored to perfection, with a neckline that was daring and a silhouette that commanded attention. I saw Mark's jaw drop as I approached. He blinked, looking at me as if he was seeing a stranger. "Sarah," he stammered, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. "You look incredible. I have never seen that dress." "I bought it for a special occasion," I replied, my voice smooth and cool as polished glass. "Tonight is full of surprises, is it not?" Jessica's smile faltered for a second, her eyes narrowing with jealousy, but she quickly recovered. "You look nice, Sarah. Very bold for you." "Where is grandmother?" Mark asked, scanning the room, his greed barely concealed. "She is holding court," I said, pointing to the fireplace. Beatrice sat in her high-backed velvet armchair like a queen on her throne. She wore black, severe and elegant. She was not speaking to anyone. She was simply watching. Her gaze locked onto Mark and Jessica as they approached, dissecting them with surgical precision. My parents rushed over to hug Jessica, cooing over her dress, oblivious to the serpent they were embracing. Mark leaned in close to my ear, his hand resting on the small of my back. His touch burned, but I did not flinch. "Just think, baby," he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "After tonight, everything changes. The debts, the stress. It will all be gone." "We are going to be free." I turned to him, looking deep into his deceitful eyes. "Yes, Mark, you are absolutely right. Everything changes tonight." He took my words as agreement, squeezing my waist. He had no idea I was agreeing to his destruction. At 8 o'clock, the heavy oak doors opened again, and Mr. Henderson walked in. He was a man of few words and severe expressions. He carried a battered leather briefcase that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Mark's eyes lit up. He actually licked his lips. He nudged Jessica, and I saw a look pass between them, pure, unadulterated avarice. Beatrice cleared her throat. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the chatter. Clink, clink, clink. The room fell into a hush. The music stopped. My parents smiled expectantly. Mark's creditors shifted their weight, crossing their arms. Mark and Jessica stood side by side near the tree. I saw Jessica's hand slip under the white tablecloth of the side table, and I knew, without looking, that she was intertwining her fingers with Mark's. They were holding hands right in front of everyone, hidden by a thin layer of linen, united in their anticipation of the kill. "Thank you all for coming," Beatrice said, her voice not wavering in the slightest. "Please, gather round. I have an announcement to make regarding the future of this family." Mark puffed out his chest. He was ready to receive his prize. I took a sip of my wine, tasting the victory before it even touched my lips. The trap was sprung. Beatrice did not whisper. She did not cough or tremble as she had done on the phone all week. She stood up from her chair without the aid of her cane, her spine rigid and her presence filling the room like a thunderhead. "We gather here to talk about legacy," Beatrice announced, her voice ringing out with the clarity of a church bell. "But legacy is nothing without loyalty. It is nothing without truth, and tonight I see very little truth in this room." Mark frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. He exchanged a nervous glance with Jessica. They had expected a dying woman's last rasping words. Not this sermon of steel. Beatrice turned her gaze to me and gave a sharp, decisive nod. I lifted the remote control I had been clutching behind the folds of my red dress and pointed it at the massive television screen mounted above the fireplace. "Turn it on, Sarah," Beatrice commanded. The screen flickered to life. It was not a montage of happy family memories. It was a static image of a sound wave, dated December 20th. The audio that blasted through the surround sound speakers was crystal clear. "She is still at the office. God, she is so boring lately." Mark's voice filled the room, unmistakable and cruel. Then came Jessica's voice, purring like a cat. "Let her work. The more she works, the more we play. She is such a useful little idiot, isn't she?" A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. My mother dropped her wine glass, the crystal shattering against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. My father turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The audio shifted to the car recording. "Just need the old hag to go this Christmas. We will have everything." Mark shot up from his chair, knocking it backward. His face was a mask of sheer terror. "No, this is not real. This is fake. It is AI," he stammered, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. "Sarah, how could you?" I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply pressed the next button on the remote. The screen changed to a slideshow of documents, bank statements, gambling losses, the text messages about the jackpot. "You call this fake, Mark?" I asked, my voice cutting through his panic. "Here is the $80,000 you lost gambling online. Here is the $20,000 you borrowed from a loan shark last week to buy a car you cannot afford, using an inheritance you have not received." Jessica lunged forward, her face twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. "You are lying. You are just a jealous, bitter woman. You made this up because you know he loves me more." "Is that so?" I replied. I pressed the button one last time. A high-resolution photo appeared on the screen. It was taken through the window of Jessica's apartment. Mark was shirtless, and Jessica was in his arms, laughing, wearing the diamond necklace he had bought with my credit card. The date stamp was clearly visible in the corner. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. There was no way to spin this. There was no deep-fake excuse that could explain the intimacy captured in that frame. I stepped into the center of the room, standing between my trembling parents and the two people who had plotted my ruin. "This is not a celebration," I declared, looking directly at Mark's boss, who looked ready to vomit, and then at the creditors, whose eyes had turned predatory. "This is an exposure. My husband and my sister have been having an affair for 6 months, but worse than that, they have been conspiring to defraud my grandmother. They were waiting for her to die so they could take her money and run." Mark looked around wildly, seeking an ally, but finding only disgusted faces. His boss turned his back on him. The creditors near the buffet whispered to each other, pulling out their phones, likely calculating how to seize his assets before he went to prison. "Sarah, please." Mark wheezed, his hands shaking as he reached out. "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain," I said, looking at him with the cold detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. "The show is over. Mark, take off your mask." Mr. Henderson stepped into the suffocating silence, the sound of his dress shoes clicking against the marble floor echoing like a judge's gavel. He placed his briefcase on the dining table, right next to the untouched roast duck, and snapped the brass latches open. The sound was sharp and final. He did not look at Mark or Jessica. He looked only at the document in his hands. "The audio and visual evidence you have just seen is disturbing," Mr. Henderson began, his voice dry and professional. "However, my purpose here is to clarify the legal standing of the estate. The will Mr. Davis attempted to leverage has been revoked. I am holding the amended and restated Sterling Family Trust, executed and notarized 3 days ago." He adjusted his glasses and began to read. "Effective immediately, the entirety of Beatrice Sterling's assets, including this property, all investment portfolios, and liquid cash, have been transferred into the Sterling Family Trust. The sole trustee and beneficiary with absolute power of appointment is Sarah Davis." I watched Jessica's face turn the color of ash. She had gambled her relationship with me for a payout that no longer existed. "Regarding the secondary beneficiary, Jessica Sterling," Mr. Henderson continued, not looking up, "the grantor leaves the sum of $1. This amount is bequeathed to ensure she cannot contest the validity of this trust by claiming she was accidentally omitted." $1, Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "You cannot do this, I am family." "You were family," Beatrice said from her chair, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Now, you are a stranger with $1. Mr. Henderson raised a hand to silence her. "There is also a newly added asset protection clause. It states that any current or future spouse of the beneficiary, Sarah Davis, is explicitly excluded from any distribution or benefit from this trust. In the event of a divorce, the trust assets are not considered marital property." Mark staggered back, hitting the edge of the buffet table. His eyes were wild, darting from the lawyer to me. He realized that even if he stayed married to me, he would never touch a cent of the money he had killed his conscience for. But the lawyer was not finished. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a stack of papers bound with a thick rubber band. "Finally, we address the matter of liabilities," Mr. Henderson said, turning his gaze to Mark for the first time. "Mr. Davis, you have accumulated significant debt. $85,000 in unsecured personal loans and $20,000 from a private lending entity known for aggressive collection tactics." Mark wiped sweat from his upper lip. That is my private business." "Not anymore," Mr. Henderson replied coldly. "To protect the family reputation from the scandal of a bankruptcy or criminal collection, the Sterling Corporation has purchased these debts. We bought the notes from your creditors this morning at 70 cents on the dollar." I stepped forward, crossing my arms over my chest. "Do you understand what that means? Mark, it means you do not owe the bank anymore. You do not owe the loan sharks. You owe us. You owe me." Mark made a sound like a wounded animal, his knees giving way as he slumped against the wall. He had planned to walk away a millionaire. Instead, he was standing before the wife he had betrayed, owing her over $100,000 that he had no way of repaying. Jessica let out a sob and threw herself at Beatrice's feet, grasping the hem of her black skirt. "Grandma, please, you have to stop this. Mark made me do it. I was confused. I love you." Beatrice looked down at her granddaughter with eyes that held no warmth, only a profound disappointment. She did not kick Jessica away, but she pulled her skirt from her grip with a slow, deliberate motion. "You are not confused, child," Beatrice said softly. "You are greedy. You looked at me and saw a pile of cash. You looked at your sister and saw a stepping stone. You chose money over family. Now, you have neither." My mother and father, who had stood paralyzed by shock for the last 10 minutes, finally moved. My mother turned her head away, refusing to look at Jessica. My father stepped between Jessica and Beatrice, his face hard. "Get up," my father said, his voice shaking with restrained anger. "Do not embarrass yourself further. You have broken your mother's heart." The financial ruin was absolute. There was no screaming match that could equal the devastation of that moment. I watched the hope drain out of Mark's eyes, replaced by the crushing weight of a debt that would shackle him for decades. This was better than revenge. This was foreclosure. I slid the diamond band off my finger. It felt heavy, burdened with 5 years of lies. I tossed it at Mark. It hit his chest and fell to the marble floor with a hollow clink. "I filed for divorce at 9 o'clock this morning," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "The grounds are adultery and attempted fraud. My lawyer has everything. There is no negotiation." Mark stared at the ring, then at me. His face twisted from shock into a snarl. You cannot do this. I am your husband. You cannot just throw me away." "Get out," I commanded, pointing to the massive oak doors. "Both of you, get out of my grandmother's house." Mark lunged. He moved fast, his hands reaching for my throat, his eyes manic with desperation. "You bitch! You think you can ruin me? I will." He never finished the sentence. 2 large men in dark suits, private security Beatrice had hired hours ago, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. They intercepted him effortlessly. One twisted Mark's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees with a groan of pain. "Let me go!" Mark screamed, thrashing against the hold. "This is assault. It is self-defense." A deep voice rumbled from the crowd. It was Mr. Sterling, Mark's CEO. He stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and fury. He looked down at his employee with pure disgust. "Mark, you are fired. Effective immediately. Do not bother coming to the office to clear your desk. I will have security mail your box. I cannot have a thief and a fraud representing my firm." Mark went limp, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Jessica, begging for help, but she was busy dealing with her own judgment. My mother stood before Jessica. Tears were streaming down her face, but her posture was rigid. "Mom, please," Jessica sobbed, reaching out. "It is not what it looks like. Do not touch me," my mother said, stepping back as if burned. "We gave you everything. Jessica, we bailed you out. We supported you, and you repay us by trying to destroy your sister, by waiting for your grandmother to die." "But Jessica stammered. "Get out," my father added, his voice cracking with heartbreak. "Do not come to our house. We are cutting off your allowance. You want to be an adult? Go be an adult. Pay your own bills." Jessica looked around, wild-eyed. She looked at me, her eyes filled with venom. I walked up to her, invading her personal space. "You wanted him so bad. Jessica, you wanted my life. Congratulations. He is yours." I leaned in close, my voice a whisper only she could hear. "And so is his debt. He owes the trust $105,000. Since you two are partners, I am sure you can help him pay it back." The front doors swung open. Blue and red lights flashed against the snow outside. Two uniformed officers walked in, shaking the snow off their boots. Beatrice had called them the moment the presentation started. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" the officer asked Beatrice. "Yes," Beatrice replied, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "These two are trespassing and making threats. Remove them." The security guards hauled Mark to his feet and dragged him toward the door. The police grabbed Jessica by the arm as she tried to resist. They did not let them grab their coats from the cloakroom. "Wait, my coat, it is freezing!" Jessica shrieked as the officer pushed her toward the open door. "Move," the officer said firmly. They were shoved out into the biting December wind. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, sealing out the cold and the toxicity. I walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling heavily. Mark and Jessica stood on the driveway, shivering violently in their evening wear. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They were screaming at each other, their voices muffled by the glass, blaming one another for the disaster they had created. I watched them for a long moment, waiting for the familiar pang of guilt or pity. It never came. All I felt was the lightness of a cancer being cut from my body. I turned back to the room. The silence was absolute, but it was peaceful now. I walked over to the fireplace and knelt beside Beatrice's chair. I wrapped my arms around her frail waist and buried my face in her lap. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving me." Beatrice stroked my hair, her hand steady and warm. "We saved each other, my dear," she said softly. "Now, stand up. The trash is gone. It is time to enjoy Christmas." The heavy oak doors had barely latched shut when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was as if a window had been opened in a stuffy room, letting in crisp, clean air. The frantic energy of the confrontation dissipated, replaced by a solemn, dignified calm. The guests, who had been frozen in shock just moments before, began to move again. They did not leave. Instead, they seemed to draw closer to the center of the room, drawn to the strength that radiated from the fireplace where my grandmother and I stood. Waiters appeared from the kitchen, moving silently to refill glasses, not with the frantic pace of a party, but with the reverence of a ceremony. Mr. Sterling, Mark's former boss, was the first to approach us. He looked at me with a newfound respect, raising his glass of champagne. "I have sat in boardrooms with sharks for 30 years, he said, his voice deep and sincere. "But I have never seen a negotiation handled with such precision. To Sarah and to Beatrice, to the truth." "To the truth?" The room echoed in unison. My parents came to me then. My mother's eyes were red, and my father looked 10 years older than he had an hour ago. But they stood on my side of the line. They hugged me, holding on tight, as if checking to make sure I was still whole. I realized then that I was. I had not broken. In fact, I felt stronger than I had in my entire life. I looked around the room and realized I had not lost a husband or a sister. I had simply excised a malignant tumor that had been draining the life out of me. I had lost nothing of value. I had only gained my freedom. "Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and approached, opening the leather portfolio he still carried. He did not speak to the room this time, but only to me. "Mrs. Davis, or rather, Ms. Sterling," he corrected himself with a rare, faint smile. "Here are the transfer documents for the interim management of the estate. As of tonight, you have full signature authority on all accounts. The keys to the safe deposit boxes are in your possession." He handed me the heavy file. It felt solid in my hands. It was not just paper, it was the baton being passed. I was no longer just the creative director or the granddaughter. I was the matriarch in training. I was the protector of this legacy. Curiosity tugged at me one last time. I walked over to the discrete panel on the wall that controlled the home security system and tapped the screen. The feed from the external cameras flickered to life in black and white night vision. It was a pitiful scene. Outside the iron gates, snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets. Under the harsh glow of the street lamps, Mark and Jessica were locked in a vicious argument. I could not hear them, but their body language screamed of hatred. Mark was waving his arms wildly, pointing a finger in Jessica's face, likely blaming her for the catastrophe. Jessica was shivering violently in her thin sequin dress, shoving him back, her face twisted in a scream. They were cold, they were broke, and they were stuck with each other. It was a hell of their own making. I watched them for 10 seconds. Then, I reached out and pressed the power button. The screen went black. I did not need to see how their night ended. They were no longer characters in my story. I had written them out. Beatrice moved to stand beside me. She did not look at the blank screen. She looked at me. She took my hand in hers, her skin paper thin, but her grip iron strong. "Christmas is a time for tradition," Beatrice said softly, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that spanned 80 years. "But it is also a time for cleaning. We sweep out the old dust to make room for the new year. Tonight, we did some very necessary cleaning." "We certainly did," I replied, squeezing her hand. I walked toward the massive Christmas tree that dominated the corner of the hall. The lights reflected in the glass doors, creating 1,000 tiny stars. I took a sip of my wine. It tasted rich and complex, with no aftertaste of bitterness. I felt a sense of absolute liberation washing over me. There was no guilt. There was no lingering question of what if. I had offered them loyalty, and they had chosen betrayal. I had offered them family, and they had chosen greed. The punishment fit the crime perfectly. I stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the holiday lights, looking out at a future that was entirely mine to design. I was alone, yes, but I was not lonely. I was victorious. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I am dying to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's chat. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach more people who need a little inspiration to stand up for themselves.